Mm.
The whole idea that a prophet can't make a mistake can't be, it flies in the face uh, of all of the scriptural evidence and really of the central purpose of mortality, which is learning the good from the evil through our own mistakes. Fallibility isn't just sort of a bug in the system, it's the very purpose of why we came to earth to make mistakes. And it made it very clear to me that people's responses to that come from a place of fear, come from a place of terror. It's that we don't have a good answer to that question. We don't have an institutional answer to that question because we've never wrestled with institutional fallibility in the way that I think we need to, and that I think eventually we will, because we really have no choice but to do it.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and truth claims. And I have back joining me again, friend and author of A Faithful Response to the CS Letter, Jim Bennett. Jim, thanks for coming back on. This is going to be fun.
Very, very happy to be here with you, Stephen.
Yeah, I've loved all of our previous discussions. And also, I've forgotten to mention that you're a co-host on the Inside Out podcast, and I've had you and Ian on recently as well. We're going to be having a discussion and a conversation about prophetic fallibility and how we are to handle when prophets make mistakes, whether or not moral or doctrinal mistakes. And this is something that you're quite passionate about. You had even started writing a book on it. I don't believe it's been
I have
published.
finished writing a book on it, and I'm trying to find
Brilliant.
someone to publish it. So I don't know what to do with it.
And what's the name of the book?
Fallibility, a love story.
Okay. Well, very good. So this is right up your alley because on my channel I try to bring on either the best scholars or people who have written articles and books. And whenever
I
I looked
appreciate
up
you settling
books,
for me.
well, whenever I looked up books on prophetic fallibility, I couldn't find one book from a faithful scholar that actually addressed prophetic fallibility. You know, you've Paul Reeves who addressed the priesthood ban and things like that, but one just on the fallibility of prophets. And I think it's an important, but it's also a challenging topic as well, because it doesn't just deal with fallibility and mistakes in the history with past leaders and prophets, but it also has to do with current ones and perhaps that fear of not wanting to criticize or undermine the current prophet and
right.
apostles. But maybe we could begin. There's so many things I want to talk about. What do you think are maybe some of the views or beliefs, assumptions, expectations that we have of prophets growing up in the church, which may not be accurate or that might be misguided?
Oh, there's so many. It all comes back to the cliche or joke, which I'm sure you've heard, the idea that Catholics teach that the Pope is infallible, but they don't believe it.
Right.
Mormons teach the prophet is fallible, but they don't believe it. And that really is where we function. If you press people, I mean, Dallin Oaks, when he first got into the first presidency, one of the first things he said in that press conference, when he was asked a question by my cousin Peggy Fletcher Stack,
Oh, I
is
didn't know
we
she
don't.
was your cousin.
She is my cousin. I'm allowed to say that now because I went on the Mormon Land podcast with her, and so she announced that publicly. Uh, she's a Bennett on her mother's side. Her mother was my father's sister. So Rosemary Bennett Fletcher. Anyway, um, yeah, but President Oaks, as soon as he became President Oaks in the first presidency, said we don't believe in infallible leaders. And if you talk to them one on one, they will all say that. But de facto, we treat them as if they are infallible. They ask us to treat them as if they are infallible. And indeed, what has developed as a result of that is what I sort of call the limited fallibility model. Jacob Hansen has his, what does he call it? His collective witness model.
Hmm.
So this is Jim Bennett's own innovation, the limited fallibility model, which is this idea that a prophet is fallible. If you go on the Fair Mormon website or Fair Latter-day Saint website, I'm wondering if we're now allowed to say Mormon again. It seems like it's starting to creep back into the vocabulary, but that's with President Nelson's passing. If you go to the Fair Latter-day Saint website, they'll say, "Oh yeah, prophets are fallible. They can forget your birthday. They can be irritable. They can have bad breath." I mean, that's literally the quote. And you go, okay, but that's not what people talk about
Right. Those are
when
very
prophets are
minor things.
fallible.
Because I
I mean,
remember, I think I shared this with you before years ago, that President Nelson visited my mission whenever I was a missionary. So he would have been president of the Quorum of the 12 at the time. And he cited a scripture passage. It was, when you're in the service of your fellow beings, you're in the service of your God. Actually, a missionary recited it, and he said, "Oh, Mosiah 3:19, like good scripture." And I, knew my seminary scripture masteries pretty well, and it was Mosiah 2:17, and that kind of rocked me at the time. I was like, "Whoa, like he's a prophet; he should know the scripture." But then,
yeah,
like, if I were to be like, "Oh, I don't believe he's a prophet anymore," just because of that, that might be like unrealistic expectations, and expecting him to be, infallible. So those are like minor things. So those are the sort of things that Fair is alluding to,
yeah,
which aren't
yeah,
really the things that cause issues to people.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when we talk about fallibility, I remember talking to RFM about this, and he said the word I ought to use is inerrancy. We don't believe in prophetic inerrancy.
Right. Doctrinal inerrancy.
Because people insist that as soon as a prophet stands at a pulpit, that there is no possibility that what they're saying isn't exactly what the Lord would be saying if the Lord were standing at the pulpit. And we quote the Doctrine and Covenants, whether by mine own voice or the voice of my servants, it is the same. Ripping that quote entirely out of its natural context, which, when read in its entirety, is actually decrying. That whole section is sort of decrying the idea of prophetic fallibility. It talks about the Lord speaking to his servants in their weakness. It talks about if they err, it will be made known. Basically,
If they sin, they'll be chastened.
yeah, Dan McClellan wrote an entire paper about this that I think is sort of the final word on it. And that scripture, what it is saying, it says, "What I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself. And though heaven and earth pass away, my word will not pass away, but will all be fulfilled, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants. It is the same." In other words, the message is all the words of the Lord will be fulfilled, whether those words are spoken by the Lord himself or by his servants. It doesn't matter. They will all be fulfilled. That is not at all the same thing as saying everything that one of the Lord's servants says is exactly the same as what the Lord says. That is an entirely different proposition, and you can only get to that proposition by ripping that clause out of the entire verse. And the other thing about it is that it's not even talking about the president of the church or apostles. It's talking about the servants of the Lord. In the context of the revelation, those servants essentially are the missionaries of the Lord, the people going out to preach the word of the Lord.
Hmm.
And word will all be fulfilled, no matter which of the Lord's servants are the ones that say it. If it's the word of the Lord, it's going to be fulfilled. But we have jerry-rigged, or is that the right term? This sort of Rube Goldberg contraption of prophetic
Or
fallibility.
proof texting and taking it out of its
Yeah,
context.
yeah. I mean, and it all falls apart at the slightest touch. I mean, because there are so many contradictions to it. We say that we're not infallible, but by the voice of the Lord, it's the same. The other thing is this whole idea of the Lord, the prophet can never lead the church astray,
Right.
which again is also sort of ripped out of its original context. You mentioned Paul Reeve. Uh, I had the great honor of interviewing Paul Reeve for the Inconvenient Faith. Have you watched an
I
Inconvenient
have,
Faith?
yes. I noticed he was on there. Yeah,
Yeah,
because you
yeah.
had an episode all about race in the priesthood.
So that was directed. That whole thing was directed by Robert Reynolds, who is the brother of Dan Reynolds of Imagine Dragons. He's also the manager of the Killers. And he funded the whole thing out of pocket. He directed all of it and conducted all the interviews. I was at several of the interviews with him, and I edited a good portion of it. We handed it off to a much better editor. I sort of got a kind of an assembly cut of what it should be, but we handed it off to somebody who fine tuned it and made it look pretty. And he did a lot more than that. I don't want to downplay his contribution or overstate mine. But the great thing about it was that Robert was not able to get to Utah to interview Paul Reeve, and so he asked me to do it. So I got to conduct that interview, and I'd never met him, but we had a long discussion, and we discussed both of these things. Part of it, I think, made it into the documentary. I think part of it did not. I quote part of it in my unpublished book called Fallibility, a Love Story. If there's a publisher out there that wants to publish Jim Bennett's magnum opus, I'd be open to it. I don't really want to self-publish it. But he talks about when that statement was made, the church was on the border of being completely ripped in half. The manifesto, which was not presented as a revelation and did not actually function as a revelation for at least 10 years. I mean, after the manifesto was issued, the church continued to authorize plural marriages. The language in the manifesto is we're not going to conduct any marriages that are against the law of the land, which was the loophole. So they went down to Mexico where it was not against the law of the land and created colonies in Mexico where they could be polygamists. It wasn't until 1910 that the church started to excommunicate people who entered into new polygamous marriages. But he said, Wilford Woodruff is trying to calm a church that is on the midst of schism and is saying, look, if this were not the Lord would never allow me to lead the church astray like this. This is such a huge decision that if I were to try to do this, the Lord would remove me from my place. He says, we don't really understand the circumstances or the exigencies that prompted Wilford Woodruff to make that statement. He says, but if you go and you look at similar statements by other prophets, they qualify that. Brigham Young particularly qualifies the idea of not leading people astray with adverbs like knowingly and designedly. There's a quote from Brigham Young that I love. It's like, do not ask me if I cannot make a mistake, for I will admit all of the day long that I can. I'm paraphrasing somewhat here. I don't have it in front of me. He says, but I would no sooner knowingly or designedly lead this church astray by a hair's breadth, or the Lord would remove me from my place. And so I take that whole promise of that the prophet won't lead the church astray to be a promise of intent and not a promise of impact. In other words, the Lord will never allow a prophet to be a prophet if he's sort of a sleeper agent for Satan. If he gets to be a prophet, it's like, aha, now I'm here. Now I can bring the church down. The Lord's not going to allow that to happen. That's very different from saying the Lord's not going to allow the prophet to wander in the wilderness for 40 years along with the rest of the children of Israel. The whole idea that a prophet can't make a mistake can't be, it flies in the face of all of the scriptural evidence and really of the central purpose of mortality, which is learning the good from the evil through our own mistakes. Fallibility isn't just sort of a bug in the system. It's the very purpose of why we came to earth, to make mistakes. And so we should expect them, and we should expect them at every level of human experience, because There's no ecclesiastical authority or office at which your agency is extracted from you. In order for a prophet to be infallible, they have to be incapable of making a mistake, which means that they have to have their agency removed. That never happens. That will never happen. And so we should not just, acknowledge fallibility. We should expect it. We should embrace it. That's a very long answer to what I'm not even sure what your initial question was.
Well, an analogy that came to my mind that I've heard given before, talking about the prophet will never lead the church astray versus the prophet might make mistakes. Would you sort of see it as the analogy of the prophet, sort of like the bus driver, and he's trying to bring us to this destination, to Christ or the celestial kingdom, and the goal, he's not going to lead us astray from leading us there, but he might take a wrong turn. And there might be a diversion, but he's not intentionally trying to lead us away from the destination, from Christ, from the celestial kingdom. But that doesn't mean that there may not be errors or diversions or going a different route, but eventually it will reroute towards that destination. Will that be a fair analogy?
Yeah, I can poke some holes in it, but I think overall that analogy is pretty solid. Yeah, he's never going to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to take you to Christ and then, secretly drive you across town on purpose. But yeah, he can take a wrong turn. He can make mistakes. But see, the problem people have with fallibility. I remember having a conversation with Dan Peterson online. I've met him several times in person, but this conversation was online. And he said, "Look, I'm open to the possibility that the priesthood ban was a mistake, but I can't wrap my brain around the idea that the Lord let that mistake endure for 125 years."
Right.
And I can. I absolutely can. And not only, and Paul Reeve can. And Paul Reeve offered, I think, the best explanation of that.
Yeah. I had him on as well. I don't know if you've seen my interview with him, but
Oh no, I haven't. I need to watch it.
yeah. It was like a 2.5 hour
Did he
conversation.
talk about the whole idea of the children of Israel and wanting a king and how that
He
relates
did.
to race?
Yes.
I think that's the best analogy here.
Yeah, and I think we'll maybe talk about this again a little bit later, but I think Paul provided two really good reasons why it did continue for so long. One was the false narrative being attributed back to Joseph Smith, the belief that the priesthood ban originated with Joseph Smith. So those false memories about the priesthood ban, and also the following president of the church and apostles didn't want to go against the precedent of the previous prophet, sort of having this mindset of this is the way it's always been, this is the doctrine. Black people have never had the priesthood, and it really wasn't until sort of mid 20th century where they started to question it, and then with the civil rights movement, and then right before with the Lester Bush article and other things, that sort of led them to really question and seek revelation on it, and it seemed it was just unquestioned and unchallenged because of those false memories and because of not willing to challenge the revelation or the position.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think it endured for some bit because it was entirely in line with the mores of the day.
Yes, that
Sadly,
too.
it didn't occur to anybody that treating black people like second-class citizens, that there was anything wrong with that. It didn't. I think it probably wasn't until the 60s where that was like, hey. So I grew up with a number of family stories on this. With David O. Mackay as my great grandfather. I remember as a kid talking to my parents about this, saying, I have a really hard time with this. I grew up in Los Angeles, California. I was in a performing arts group called the Kids of the Century. That's the previous century, not this century. I haven't been a kid in this century. And this was in the greater metropolitan Los Angeles area. And I was sort of one of the token white guys. I mean, most of the people involved in this were of all kinds of ethnicities, including African Americans. And it really troubled me that I'm with all these people, and I thought, what would they think of me if they knew that I belong to a church that teaches that they bear the curse of Cain, that they were somehow less righteous in the pre-existence? And I just had such a hard time with that. I believed it. I believed it sort of unquestioningly and tried to figure out some way to convince myself that it wasn't racist, and was never able to really do that. But so I remember talking to my parents about it, and they said, "Oh, your grandmother, who was married to David O. McKay's oldest son, was the general primary president." And she went to Papa Dade, which is the family name for David O. McKay. She went to Papa Dade and said, we have these young black kids that are coming up in primary, and I think it's a real shame that they can't be ordained to the priesthood and go on to be deacons like all of their friends. And Papa Dade said, yeah, so do I. See, that's proof, because if this were just a man doing it, he could have changed it like that. And I kind of accepted that and said, okay, so God's the racist, not Brigham Young and David O. McKay and everybody else.
Right.
And the more you dive into that, the flimsier that kind of excuse becomes. I become quite good friends with Greg Prince. We've had him on our podcast over a dozen times now. He's kind of the unofficial third host of the Inside Out podcast. And his book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, is, I think, the quintessential book about essentially the modern church. And David O. McKay is the centerpiece of it. And you read it, and I discover my great-grandfather was a segregationist. He absolutely did not believe in the equality of races. He absolutely did not believe that black people and white people should ever intermarry. So I sat there and I went, okay, so whatever revelation David O. McKay wanted, it wasn't a revelation that would have made black people equal to white people in the church. It would have been a revelation that maybe gave them the priesthood, but with limits, and that excluded them from interracial marriage or whatever.
It wouldn't be full inclusion and integration.
It wouldn't be full inclusion. So the only way I can see God's hand in that whole ban is in the way Paul Reeve described it. I often quote I think it's the 4th chapter of Jacob that talks about the Jews looking beyond the mark, and because they hath desired it, God hath done it, that they may stumble. And the idea is, Paul Reeve makes the case that Mormons wanted very much to sort of assert their whiteness in the 19th century. They were being otherized by the rest of the nation and were being sort of characterized as a subhuman race, that Mormonism was a race and that we were all sort of subhuman. And the way to overcome that, at least in Brigham Young's mind, was to embrace the Protestant justifications for slavery, which is where the curse of Cain idea comes from. That predates the church by at least 100 years. And embrace that in order for the rest of the nation to accept us as white. And if I can see God's hand, it's, oh, that's what you want? All right, well, then that's what you can have. Enjoy the consequences. Hope you learn from them. And it's like, well, wait a minute, we don't want this anymore. It's like, oh, really? You don't want this anymore? What is it you want? And it's David O. McKay saying, well, we want to make them almost equal. And God's like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's not until Spencer Kimball says, okay, we want to lift this entirely and give them all the rights and privileges of every other member of the church that God finally gives the okay. So that, again, it's a lesson in fallibility. It's a lesson in, this is what the mortal experience teaches us. This is why we came here, is we ought to learn something from this. And too many members of the church, what they learn from it is, well, God was a racist for reasons we don't understand. And I think that's the wrong lesson.
And the church now in the Gospel Topics essay has gone so far to say that we disavow those past teachings and statements that black skin is a sign of cursing or disfavor before God. They disavow the curse of Cain doctrine by Brigham Young, or blacks not being valiant or being neutral in the premortal existence. They don't go quite so far as to say it wasn't from God, but my conclusion is that I don't believe it came from God. It's very hard to say that the ban came from God, but all the justifications for it were not from God. I think Brigham Young made it quite clear what the justifications were for the priesthood ban. And sort of getting back to our views and assumptions growing up in the church, I very much had this view of prophets, and I think I'm not alone in this from what I was hearing both at church, Sunday school, sacrament meeting talks, but also I would say general conference as well, is that, they're prophets, seers, and revelators. They're the mouthpiece of the Lord. They speak to God and speak for God. I would have believed they're all special witnesses of Christ, that they've all seen the Savior. And I would have viewed that the prophet would have regularly, gone and communed with the Lord and received direct revelation, in the Holy of Holies. And as we said before, follow the prophet, he won't lead you astray, whether by my own voice or the voice of my servants, it is the same. And then when you learn about the priesthood ban going on for over 125 years, and then if you come to the conclusion this wasn't from God, I feel like it sort of shatters that paradigm of the Lord speaking directly to them all the time, because then you're like, well, why did it go on for so long? And I guess we've been sort of talking about this, but how would you answer someone who says, like, if they are prophets of God and if he speaks directly to them, how did it go on for this long? Why didn't he intervene and correct it? Why not soon into Brigham Young instituting it? Did God not say, no, that's wrong, stop? Because some people would look at the priesthood ban and say, was the church not led astray with racism for over 125 years?
Uh, yeah. I mean, yes to all of that. So backing up just a little bit on it. Um, I mean, to say the church was led astray on it. I mean, I want to make the distinction between being led astray and making the mistake. Because in my mind, being led astray would be, okay, I'm Brigham Young. I know the Lord wants full racial equality, but I want racism. And so I'm going to pursue racism. I'm going to make a deliberate decision to not do what the Lord wants.
Right.
That's
So,
how
so
I
it's not
define.
intentional rebellion on the part of Brigham Young.
No, I don't think this was ever intentional rebellion on the part of Brigham Young or on the part of anybody else, but I think it was a gross and colossal mistake. And I believe that the false doctrine of prophetic infallibility is at the root of every major problem with the church throughout its history, from the past up until today. Because, yeah, I don't know if I believed what you're talking about. I think I probably did. The idea that, okay, yeah, this is a church led by Jesus Christ, which means the prophet is constantly talking to Jesus Christ face to face, the way I am talking to Stephen Murphy right now. I know I talk to a lot of members of the church, some of whom assume that, okay, yeah, the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency have a meeting every Thursday. Jesus doesn't come to all those meetings, but he probably comes to at least half of them. Or I mean, this really is the mindset that all of these things are happening
And when people will
with.
talk about, like, when the prophet goes to the Holy of Holies, we know why he's there.
Yeah.
That's where the Lord comes and communes with him.
So I remember having a conversation with my father. We were sitting in the conference center when he was a senator, a United States senator. He got extra tickets, and he would always to general conference, and he would always bring one of his sons or nephew or grandsons. And on this occasion, it was me and it was my nephew. And my nephew turned to him and says, "So, how many times do you think President Hinckley has seen Jesus?" And my father said, maybe once if he's really lucky. And my nephew was like, "What are you talking about? He's the prophet." And he says, that's not how this works. It was another general conference where I went with my father, and it was over. And then he said, "Oh, dang it, I forgot about this. I have a meeting with the presiding bishopric, and it shouldn't take very long." Do you mind just hanging around for that? I'm like, well, you're my ride. I don't really have a choice. So I go into this meeting with the presiding bishopric, and it's the people in the meeting are the presiding bishopric, and I can't remember any of their names, and my father, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, Senator Gordon Smith of Oregon, who is now the director of church hosting, but he was a Latter day Saint senator, and Jim Bennett, stupid kid, sitting in the corner. And the discussion was about the church trying to buy Martin's Cove. Are you familiar with Martin's Cove?
I've heard of it.
Martin's Cove, there's that story about people leaving late in the season to come west with hand carts, and they get trapped in a blizzard at Martin's Cove. And so Brigham Young cancels all
Oh,
meetings in
right.
Utah. They all go out, and this is in Wyoming. They all go out and they rescue these people, and several
Yes.
people die.
Is that the Ephraim's Rescue movie is based on that? Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. I
Okay.
haven't
Yeah.
seen that movie, but I think that's right. I mean, this is that story, and the church had gotten a lease on Martin's Cove, but Martin's Cove was on federal land, and it was on, I think, in a federal wilderness area, which doesn't allow any improvements on the land. And the church wanted to buy it outright and turn it into a visitor center. And to do that, they needed an act of Congress. They needed congressional approval. And at the time, Harry Reid, Democrat, also a member of the church, and at that time he was the Senate Minority Whip. In other words, the number 2 senator in the United States Senate. He went on to become the Senate Majority Leader at some point. He is to date, the highest ranking American elected official from the church, and he was a hardcore Democrat, which drives a lot of the conservative members crazy. But the whole meeting was focused on how do we roll Harry Reid. I mean, you have this idea of general authorities living in this sort of beautiful ethereal bubble where they're on this spiritual plane above the rest of us. And this meeting was a very back room sort, I call it a smoke-filled room if they smoked. It's one of these kind of, what do we do? We gotta roll him. He's not church broke was the term they kept using. And and at one point, Orrin Hatch asked, well, why don't you just have President Hinckley call him? And they said, oh, President Hinckley doesn't want to do that. We asked him and he won't do it. And they were really kind of upset at President Hinckley for not doing this. And I'm just sitting here with my eyes wide open going, what is this? This is big time disagreements behind the scenes about what to do. The presiding bishopric is upset with President Hinckley behind the scenes. President Hinckley isn't doing. And so we come out of this meeting and we're driving home, and I was kind of shook up by what I had just seen. And I said to Dad, that's amazing. I don't. And he says, well, what was your problem with it? And I said, well, these are the servants of the Lord. Why don't they agree? And he said, because they all have agency and they're all capable of disagreeing. And I said, oh, well, why doesn't the Lord just tell them what to do so that they don't disagree? And his response was, oh, well, that's one more vote for Satan's plan. And I went, okay. And the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about it in the intervening years, is that the idea that we come to earth and leave the presence of God to walk by faith, to learn the good from the evil. But the way we do that is, the reason we couldn't do that in God's presence is God is there as the perfect example of what good is. And so we really don't have to make that decision. We don't have to judge for ourselves. We can just look at this perfect paragon and do that. So the idea that we come to this earth and then we do the same thing that we did in the premortal life, only this time we're looking at a man, We're looking at a perfect prophet, and we just have to do what he says, and we don't have to struggle and make decisions for ourselves and make mistakes for ourselves because all we have to do is just listen to the prophet. He'll tell us everything we need to do. That really is Satan's plan. That is not the purpose of mortality, and yet that's what everybody's looking for, and that's what everybody gets disappointed by when it turns out that that's not the case, and it's simply not the case.
So, what do you think is a better, we've been talking about this a bit, better framework and paradigm for understanding the role of a prophet, the authority and position of a prophet, but also how they receive revelation and sort of this combination of the human and the divine, and seeing them as products of their own culture, and they have their own biases and prejudices and their own judgments. And while we believe they can receive revelation and inspiration for the church, uh, I think perhaps we had very literalistic views, or that they're always receiving revelation all the time. What do you think sort of a better paradigm or understanding of prophets, making moral mistakes, and also how they receive revelation?
I think the minute we understand that they receive revelation the same way you and I receive revelation, they experience God the same way you and I experience God. The minute we do that, we also are able to embrace the idea that you and I have as much direct access to heaven as Dallin H. Oaks does. And that's, I think, an extraordinarily empowering idea. And then they say that, well, what do I need a prophet for? Well, I mean, you look at the Book of Mormon, it talks about it, all things must be done in order. The idea that we worship together as a church, as a body of Christ, has tremendous power to it. And the idea of doing that sort of in isolation, that we're each sort of a church unto ourselves, I think deprives us of the blessings of fellowship that help us get through the mortality and weather mortality. And I think one of the big challenges of discipleship is sustaining church leaders, not because they're infallible, but precisely because they are not. I mean, that's what the word sustain means. Inherent in the word sustain is the assumption that what you are sustaining needs your help, needs you to sustain it, to lift it up, that it's going to suffer without your sustenance. We never ever talk about saying we sustain Jesus Christ in his role as Savior and Redeemer. We worship Jesus Christ. He does not need us. He does not need our help to accomplish the atonement. He did that himself. But we sustain our other weak leaders because they have the same weaknesses that all the rest of us have. And I think a lot of people go, well, then I just don't need a prophet, and I'm just going to walk away from the church, and I'm going to walk away from all of this. And I think they deprive themselves of the benefits that come from a collective association with other believers and other people of the covenant. It's it's interesting that I talk about. I'm not just trying to drop names. I always get accused of this, but David O. Mackay is my mother's grandfather. Heber J. Grant was my father's grandfather, which was a huge burden on me as a kid because I thought, whoa, I have these two great, perfect, infallible ancestors, and look at me, I'm just a schlub. I mean, it was not this inspiring thing. It was, oh, what hope is there for me? I've already made so many mistakes and I'm already such an idiot that there's no possible way I could ever live up to that reputation. But the more I've learned about both men, one of the things that's really fascinating about Heber J. Grant is he didn't consider himself a prophet. He considered the president of the church to be a managerial position, not an ecclesiastical position. Hated the song "We Thank Thee, O God, for a Prophet" when it was sung about him because he considered the prophet to be Joseph Smith, not him.
Hmm.
In fact, his father stood proxy for Joseph Smith, and Heber J. Grant was sealed. his sealed to Joseph Smith as his father in the eternities. I mean, that's another mess of polygamy that we're going to have to sort out. Again,
Do you think
another.
Brigham Young also saw that a little bit? Like in the early years, he didn't consider himself to be, a prophet, seer, revelator the same way as Joseph Smith, although he did go on to, declare certain doctrines and things. But almost like since Joseph Smith, they didn't see themselves as prophet in the same way as Joseph, because Joseph was quite unique in bringing forth new scripture and revelation and sort of restoring the church and foundational doctrine and teachings, where it almost seems that they have, we sustain that they have the priesthood keys and they are managing and directing the church and sort of making policy and codifying things, but they're not sort of doing too many doctrinal innovations or receiving new scripture like what we see with Joseph Smith. There's been a few things, since Joseph Smith, but not compared to him.
Yeah. No, I think there is some truth in that, particularly, and I think the evidence for that comes from the fact that Brigham Young did not reorganize the first presidency until I think 5 years after the death of Joseph Smith. The entire journey across the plains was led by Brigham Young as president of the Quorum of the 12,
Mm.
not as president of the church. Yeah, the first presidency wasn't reorganized until after they'd reached the Salt Lake Valley. So yeah, I think there was very much that sort of sense when Sidney Rigdon made his foray and tried to lead the church. The succession crisis, and Sidney Rigdon made his case. He proposed being sort of the caretaker for the church. That Joseph Smith would be the president of the church in perpetuity, even after death, and that it was just sort of his role to be kind of the steward or the caretaker,
Custodian.
custodian. That may have been the actual word. I was trying to think of the word. But so yeah, the model that every president of the church is equivalent to Joseph Smith in terms of their prophetic power and access is a relatively recent development. I think the first president of the church since Joseph Smith and Brigham Young to officially to talk about themselves as a prophet was David O. Mackay. I mean, all of those guys in between didn't refer to themselves as prophets, seers, and revelators. And then we start talking about how every member of the Quorum of the 12 is a prophet, seer, and revelator. But I mean,
Right.
that's you're not going to find that anywhere in the Doctrine and Covenants. That's just, I mean, the idea that the senior apostle becomes the president of the church by default is a compromise. It's not there. I mean, you cannot point to any sort of doctrinal, theological, scriptural justification for it. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it means that there's nothing in scripture or nothing in any of the revelations that would prevent the passing of the president of the church, the quorum of the 12, to call anybody to be president of the church.
Do you know what the
And
basis is for that then? That the senior
yeah,
apostle, the
well,
longest serving, becomes the next president? Is that tradition or where did that begin? Because I'm actually not sure.
it is tradition, and I think it just stems from people wanting to avoid the ugliness of the succession crisis after Joseph Smith. I think we don't really appreciate just how ugly and difficult and tenuous the position of the church was after Joseph's passing. Joseph had not publicly designated anybody as his successor. I think Joseph assumed that he would be president of the church until Jesus came. I mean, it was very much a millenarian. Is that how you pronounce it?
Maybe.
Church. I mean, it was a church that they believed that Christ was coming right then.
Hmm.
That they did not think that we will be here in 2025 still waiting for Jesus to show up. And so I think Joseph didn't really see an urgency in designating a successor. There's evidence that he designated his son as a possible successor, and I know that Mark Hoffman forged a document that was the Joseph Smith III blessing, which
Right.
does not exist as far as we know, but there are people who say that blessing did take place, even though that document was not an accurate or a legitimate representation of that blessing. But when Brigham Young made the case that it was the quorum of the 12 apostles that should lead the church, there were only 7 apostles in the quorum who stood with him. I mean, it was not a unified quorum. There were 5 apostles that were backing other sorts of candidates. And then you had James Strang, who insisted that Joseph had written him this secret note that he was supposed to be. And several of the Book of Mormon witnesses, at least 2 of them, I think, went with James Strang.
I know Martin Harris followed him for a bit.
Martin Harris followed him for a bit. I mean, I mean, this was just kind of chaos. And I think Brigham, to a large degree, prevailed through sheer force of will. I mean, everything I read about Brigham Young, this was a guy, I mean, the reason the church has survived past the passing, most religious movements do not outlast the death of their founder or their creator. Christianity survives because of the strength of Paul. That Paul, just by sort of sheer force of will, creates the early Christian church and organizes it and does all of that. And everything that we associate with the early Christian church, you can't really find it specifically in the life of Christ. You find it in the writings of Paul. And you look at the early Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith didn't organize. Somebody pointed out to me, and I was shocked, but it's true. Joseph Smith did not did not build a single meeting house during his entire time as president of the church. He was
Is that
obsessed with
right?
building temples, and they would meet in different people's homes. They would meet in different public places. But this idea of wards, this idea of stakes, really was fleshed out under Brigham Young. And he sort of created the building projects of the church. I mean, so much of the church as we now understand it, Brigham Young sort of willed into existence. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the hand of the Lord in all of this, but
Hmm.
that's how I now see the hand of the Lord. So, I mean,
Right.
when you sort of embrace fallibility, you're not waiting for it. It's just so bizarre to me how many people look at Revelations and they go, "Oh well, they only got the revelation on polygamy because the federal government was breathing down their necks." And I say, "Well, yeah, yes, of course." That's how revelation comes. Revelation comes when we ask for it and when we need it, and we clearly needed it, and we asked for it, and we got it. I mean, why? It is so bizarre to me when people try to sort of divorce the exigencies of the moment from revelation. I mean, the modern example of that, most recent example of that drives me crazy, is the whole controversy around the Manti Temple. Do you remember all that? So the
I don't
Manti
remember the specifics of the Manti Temple.
So the Manti Temple, they were talking about essentially tearing it down and building a new temple.
Hmm.
And in the Manti Temple, you have all of these Minerva Teichert murals that are considered some of the greatest works of art that the Latter-day Saints have produced. I have not seen them. I've seen representations of them, and some of them are really quite dated and quite sort of colonial. But Native Americans are anyway. That doesn't matter. They're considered really important works of art. And initially, no, they weren't going to tear it down. They were just going to turn it into the Manti Temple and the Salt Lake Temple were the only temples that still did live endowments.
Right. Right.
And they said, okay, we're going to remodel both the Salt Lake and the Manti temples, and we're no longer going to do live endowments. And initially they said, but don't worry, all of the art in these temples will be preserved. And then they gutted the Salt Lake Temple. And all of these pioneer era murals were all just sort of torn down. And when people got upset about that, they said, well, don't worry, we took pictures of them. It's like, well, you destroyed them and you said you weren't going to destroy them. And so they said, okay, now we're going to do the same thing to the Manti Temple. And people got furious and they said, you can't tear down these murals. These are priceless. These are part of our history. You cannot do that.
I'm actually
And
unaware of this. I don't remember any of
no,
this.
yeah, well, I don't know if this made any waves outside of the Utah area, but for a moment, this was really quite a big deal. Peggy made a big deal about this. I had a long
When was
conversation.
this? Like last year?
No, this is longer ago than that.
Oh, okay.
Um, about 4 or 5 years ago, I'm thinking.
Oh, okay.
It's around the time they started remodeling the Salt Lake Temple, and I had just joined the Tabernacle Choir. I joined it in 2019, and when I joined, we would take all these tunnels underground, so we didn't have to walk above ground from the conference center to the tabernacle to the dressing rooms to everything else. It's the whole mines of Moria under there. But all those tunnels were shut off when they started remodeling the temple because they are all part of the remodel. So we have to walk around above ground like civilians. But anyway, I'm being facetious for those of anybody who's being upset by that. So yeah, this happened around that time. So it would have been about 4 or 5 years ago. And then I think it was Elder Rasband, either Rasband or Renland. I think it was Rasband, made an announcement, and he said, "We have made the decision that we are going to preserve the Manti Temple, and we are going to decommission it and turn it into a museum, and then build a working temple in Ephraim, so that we don't have to. So the murals will be preserved. We will have a temple, and everybody will be happy." But he made it very clear this did not, the protests and the complaints had absolutely nothing to do with our decision. This decision came as a result of revelation, not as a result of protest. And I just went, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You would not even have considered backing off of gutting the Manti Temple if it weren't for these protests. You wouldn't even have considered it. And the idea that you just received this revelation in a vacuum with no consideration of what was happening on the ground. I mean, why do you want to perpetuate that narrative? How is that a more faithful and faith building narrative than the idea of, oh, well, yes, we got this revelation because we went and sought the revelation as a result of the fact that the members of the church were unhappy with what we were doing. I mean, they were at least willing to sort of concede that to some degree with the reversal of the policy of exclusion.
Right.
You
That was
know,
part of the influence, and the catalyst was people's reaction and the heartbreak over the policy. But I think it's to give this image that we're not giving into external pressure and to make it seem like really convenient, but they're probably wanting to try to give this image of, no, this is top down revelation. It's not that we're influenced and just giving into bottom up activism or protests.
yeah,
We're influenced.
which has never, ever, ever, ever been how the Lord has functioned with his people. You look at the Old Testament, you go back to when Israel wanted a king, which is what Paul Reeve uses as the analogy for the priesthood ban. Israel goes to the prophet, and they go to Samuel and they say, we want a king. Samuel goes to the Lord. The Lord says, a king will be the end of the nation of Israel. The king, the amount of evil and the amount of destruction that will occur as a result of a king will be devastating. You don't want a king. You shouldn't want a king. Samuel goes back, reports this, and Israel says, we don't care. We want to be like other nations. And so Samuel goes back, and the Lord helps them pick a king. It's like, okay, you want a king? I told you, I warned you, but this is what's going to happen. Okay, let me help you. That's the way it always works. The idea that the prophet is separated from the members of the church is, I think, a much more troubling idea. That he doesn't listen, that he doesn't respond, that he isn't influenced by the struggles of the people. That's a really warped model in my mind. I
Mm.
don't see how that's in any way something that the Lord would want or perpetuate, and I don't see any evidence that that's how the Lord has ever really functioned. I mean, you look at every major decision in the church. There has always been input from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And you see it in the revelations of Joseph Smith.
Right, that's what I was
You
thinking of as well. So many of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants is Joseph inquiring. It's usually in response to questions because of things happening in his circumstances or things that are happening externally that then he's going to the Lord. And similar in our personal lives, often the times where I feel like I've received answers to prayer, personal revelation has been times where I've been wrestling over something and it's in response usually to something that's currently happening at the time. And that causes you to go to God in prayer and to seek for that. And you're saying that we need to embrace that as part of the model for how prophets, as well as us as individuals, receive revelation, that it's often in response. And the catalyst often to it is the things happening in our external environment and circumstances.
No, absolutely. I mean, I remember as a young man very much wanting the Lord to confirm um, my decision as to who I was going to marry. You know, you hear all these stories about I knew she was the one, and I prayed, and the Lord confirmed that this was my eternal companion. And I dated a number of girls and didn't feel right about any of them. And then I started dating my current wife and thought, okay, yeah, I think this is the right decision. And I remember just pleading in prayer, please confirm that this is the right decision, and getting nothing in response, nothing at all. And just being like, and as I got closer and closer to my wedding day, I was like, Lord, if you don't want me to do this, if this is the wrong decision, I need to know. We booked the temple. We're going in. Come on. And I remember I was kneeling across the altar as my former mission president, who was a sealer in the Salt Lake Temple, was conducting the sealing ceremony. And I got one of the clearest spiritual witnesses in my life that this was the right thing to do and that the Lord was pleased with my decision and that this was who I was supposed to marry. And I remember feeling in that moment, in this sacred moment, anger at the Lord. Like, would it have killed you to have told me this 20 minutes ago? I mean, I've already made the decision. I'm already doing it. You're not confirming this until after I do it. And as my life has gone on, it's been like, yeah, that's how this works. That's how this works. Because if it weren't that way, then again, we're back to Satan's plan. It's like, oh, you don't have to make decisions. You don't have to live with the consequences of your bad decisions. I'll just spoon feed you the answers from the back of the book the whole way, and you never have to make the decision and live with the consequences of it. So that has really sort of colored and influenced how I perceive how revelation works on an individual basis, and I think that's kind of how revelation works for the church too.
Right.
Uh,
That
so
they receive revelation often similar in a way that we receive it through, feelings, impressions, perhaps pure intelligence, maybe sometimes as well having dramatic experiences or dreams. And there's people that have those sorts of experiences as personal revelation, and that's maybe a way to understand that while we believe that they have that prophetic authority and they hold the keys and they're sort of stewards over the entire church, and the prophet receives revelation for the church, but it's not in a totally different way to how we can receive revelation for our own personal lives or someone in a calling, because in a way we're prophets of our own lives. So it's perhaps understanding that it's similar to how they receive revelation is similar to us. And if that is the case, there's been times in my life similar to you where I've gone through seasons where I've been wrestling over something, praying for something, wanting a clear answer, and feeling that the heavens are shut, that I'm sort of left to make my own best judgment or best decision. There's been moments of like a little bit of inspiration or like the still small voice leading a certain way, but you don't know what's going to happen. There's no clear answer or direction, and you're acting upon the previous light you have and just doing the best, and you can't always demand or compel revelation. And that's something that I struggle with because I share with you whenever you interview me and on your show about my story. Some of the most dramatic revelations I had was when I came back to the church, and it seemed like it was times where it seemed like the Lord was speaking very directly to me. They were like dictated revelations almost in the sense, and they felt very dramatic. And whenever I came back to the church, I think I sort of expected that these are just going to keep happening. This is just how the Lord's always going to speak to me, and they have relatively stopped for the most part. And it's I feel almost left to my own to come up with my best decisions. And yeah, still sometimes getting moments of inspiration or insight or impression, but not receiving dramatic revelations, which can be tough because sometimes you think, no, it should always be happening that way.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I can count on one hand the times when I've received the kind of revelations like the one I just described in the temple when I got married.
Your wife.
Another one, and I keep coming back to this, is that, I mean, that policy of exclusion just about drove me out of the church. I absolutely knew to the core of my being that it was wrong, that it flew against everything that I'd ever been taught in the church. It flew against the idea that men will be punished for their own sins, not for Adam's transgression, or, as far as I was concerned, anybody else's transgressions. And yet here we were punishing children for who their parents were. It went against the idea, suffer the little children and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven, suffer them to come unto me.
Hmm.
I mean, I wrestled with this over and over and over again, and prayed, I think, as hard or harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. And my prayers at this point in my life, unless I'm praying in sacrament meeting, they aren't King James English prayers anymore. I made a decision at some point in my life where I said, "Look, Lord, if you want me to talk to you and unburden myself to you and be close to you, I need to be able to talk to you the way I'm talking to you now, because this thee and thou stuff creates a distance that I don't want. And if it's you, and that and anyway, so a lot of my prayers were me walking my dog at night and looking up at the moon and just sort of at some point screaming at the sky. I mean, I just sort of was in this sort of wrestle and was so frustrated. And I received, I think, the clearest revelation that I have ever received in my life. And it was it, it, it's very difficult to describe, because when you put it in words, it doesn't come close to capturing the totality of the experience. It gives me a whole lot more grace and understanding for what the Doctrine and Covenants is, because I no longer see the words as the revelation. I see them as Joseph describing the revelation, trying to contain it in words,
Right, clothing it into language.
clothing it in language, and so much of it slips out through the cracks. There's so much more to it. Because if I had to put it in words, the words I'd use were be patient. It will all work out in the end. And other words that I would use, and I was talking about, I want to leave the church. And there was this almost pleading kind of sense. I mean, here I have the creator of the universe, the God of heaven, sort of pleading with me humbly, please, please don't leave the church. Please don't leave the church. This is where I have put you. This is where you can do the most good. I did not hear those words. There was no angel standing in front of me, but that message was clearer to me than any message from any that anybody has ever given me verbally.
Yeah.
I mean, it spoke to my entire inner being. And it was accompanied by this feeling of total love, total acceptance, total peace. I mean, but the thing is, it's so memorable because that does not happen very often, if ever. I mean,
Yeah.
when my nephew says, "How many times has Gordon B. Hinckley, seen Jesus? Once, if he's lucky." How many times do you have experiences like that? Once, if you're lucky. I think I've had a couple, two, three, maybe. But that's not what mortality is. You take that experience. My father pointed out. Okay, look, all of the people who were witnesses, the Book of Mormon witnesses, they all saw an angel, and they all testified that they'd seen an angel for the rest of their lives, and yet they all, at some point in their lives, left the church. Uh, you know, and he said, I no longer have a problem with Laman and Lemuel. When I was a kid, it's like Laman and Lemuel see an angel, and within minutes, they're murmuring again. They're complaining about Nephi, and they're complaining about this and that and the other. I mean, these spiritual experiences are real and they're powerful, but real life is not meant to be like that. When you get a glimpse of what heaven is, it is a glimpse, and you have to sort of hang on to that. But in order to get there, you have to live your life with the judgment and with the exigencies of life. And that's what mortality is all about. That's that. And so this is why I call my book Fallibility a love story, is that when we talk about fallibility, people always sort of frame it in, okay, the church needs to come clean. Church needs to admit all of its mistakes and just sort of come clean and recognize that they've done all these things wrong. And I'm like, well, yeah, I agree. I agree. But that's only half of the story. The other half of the story is the reason the church needs to do that is because we need to teach everybody that that's how you move forward, that this is a blessing, that this is a gift, that we have learned from our mistakes, that these mistakes are not just bumps in the road, they're the reason we came here. So I don't know. I'm rambling on. I get
No,
it.
that's
Whenever I'm on these things, people complain, you talk too much, Jim. You should let the host talk more. So here,
no, I love it, and you're the guest. You talk as much as you want. Well, I think when it comes to the framework, I think this is an important framework to understand that prophets are, products of their culture, their environment. They have their own opinions and biases. And there was actually this quote from, believe it or not, Bruce R. McConkie, who seems like quite a fundamentalist, but I actually thought this was quite a good quote. This comes from Mormon doctrine, but he says, "With all their inspiration and greatness, prophets are yet mortal men with imperfections common to mankind in general. They have their opinions and prejudices and are left to work out their own problems without inspiration in many instances." And I actually think that's quite a good quote. We believe that they receive revelation, as you said, similar to us, responding to their circumstances. And probably for them, if they're not diligently seeking it urgently and wrestling and pondering over it, it's not that they have this direct pipeline to God and that they're omniscient. And similar to us, that they might go through seasons or times where revelation isn't coming and it's more complex, and that they're acting upon limited light and knowledge, but believing that they, similar to ourselves, can receive revelation and inspiration, but that they have that prophetic authority, believing that they hold the priesthood keys and they have that authority to declare doctrine and policy. But it's recognized, and this has been the hardship for me, that doctrinal mistakes or errors in policy can be made. But I think that's a shift people need to move towards. But I think the question or the concern, because this is one of my biggest issues in my faith crisis back in 2018, one of the final things that caused me to lose my faith was looking at teachings or false doctrine by past
mhm.
prophets. And one of the questions people have is, we don't need to go into every single one like Adam God or statements about, people living on the moon or on the sun or the statements about race or blood atonement. But when you look at past prophets or leaders teaching things which are considered false doctrine, things which are wrong, the question people have is how do I know when they're right if they can't be wrong? Or how do I know that what the prophets are saying today, what if they're wrong about things they're saying today in 20, 30 years time? And it calls into question how reliable are the prophets, if they can be wrong, how can I trust them?
Um, yeah, that's a great question, and it's the. I mean, I think the answer to the question is requires you to recognize that there is no person on earth that you trust who is infallible. So you look at, for instance, I'll go to my doctor. Well, how can I trust my doctor? Because my doctor is fallible and my doctor can misdiagnose me. Yeah, he can, uh, but you still trust him or her. My daughter is a doctor, so I need to make sure that I say her instead of him. Um, and prophets, you have both uh, the right and the responsibility to do as Amulek, I think, is the one who said it. I also know these things of myself. That you have to go to the Lord and say, okay, is this right? Does this, is I mean, if you trust the prophet, uh,
And blindly follow and
and,
heed his
and,
words
and
unquestionably.
if you trust the prophet, you should trust him enough to take what he says to the Lord yourself. And President Oaks has said, "Look, we are the general authorities, and we give the rules, but we don't give the exceptions. If you're an exception to this rule, you're not going to hear that at General Conference. You need to go to the Lord to know how all of this counsel applies to you." I mean, the silliest example of this is a conversation I once had with a friend of mine about Cain being Bigfoot. You know about Cain being Bigfoot?
Yeah, little Mormon
Uh,
folklore.
well, but the reason why it endures is that President Kimball put it in the Miracle of Forgiveness.
Did he?
There's a
I've read that book. I don't remember that part.
Well, he doesn't say Cain is Bigfoot, but he tells the story. It's like third or fourth hand because he's quoting from a guy who's quoting from a guy who's quoting from a conversation that he apparently had with David W. Patton, who was a member. Was he a member of the first
I think he
presidency?
was a member of the Core of the 12.
Reform of the 12. But the story is that he's wandering out in the forest or he's riding a horse and this Wookiee comes and walks up next to him, like this big hairy man. He's hairy from head to toe, and he's very dark and very black, and he's like 7 or 8 feet tall. I think of Chewbacca from Star Wars. And apparently, David W. Patton's first question to Chewbacca from Star Wars is, "Where do you dwell?" I asked him where he dwelt. And I'm like, that wouldn't have been my first question. I probably run screaming in the other direction. But this guy identifies himself as Cain and insists that he isn't capable of dying, that he is pled for death, but he has been cursed to wander the earth forever. And he's this big hairy guy, and so you extrapolate from that. Oh, well, that's why you don't have a whole species of Bigfoots, big feet, Sasquatches. You just have this one guy who's Cain, and he's wandering the earth, and that's where the folklore comes from. And Spencer Kimball puts that in the book, and it's ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's absurd. There's no reason Cain would continue to wander the earth. There's no scriptural anything that talks about that. There's no reason to believe a fourth hand account.
Yeah,
The fact that Spencer
very
Kimball believes,
unreliable source.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He just calls it like he's like an interesting story or something to think about. It's like, yeah. Anyway, so I'm talking to my friend about this, And we're both laughing about how absurd it is. And he says to me, well, I'm just so grateful that that book was published um, before he was president of the church. And I said, well, why? And he said, because if it were published when he was president of the church, we'd have to believe that. I went, no, we wouldn't. And he says, well, you have to believe the president of the church. And I said, well, no, you don't. Not if what he's saying isn't true. It's like, it's not, we don't decide whether or not to believe something as to whether or not the president of the church has said it. We decide whether or not to believe something as to whether or not it's true. President Eyring has said, there's in this church, you don't have to believe anything that isn't true. And the idea that Cain is Bigfoot is just simply not true. The fact that the president of the church may have believed that doesn't matter. It's not true. You don't have to believe that. So when you look at it, you say, okay, I trust the prophet and I respect the prophet and I sustain the prophet, certainly enough to take the prophet's counsel to the Lord and figure out how it applies to me. And I have that right, but I also have that responsibility. When people start saying things like, well, did he say that when he was president of the church? What they're asking is, can I just accept this without even thinking about it, without praying about it, without doing any of that work on my own to see how or if this applies to me? And there isn't anything in the church where we can do that, where we punt our agency to the president of the church or to an apostle or to anyone else. And I think part of the things that also come back is that, for instance, I still think that President Nelson's counsel to get rid of the word Mormon is kind of stupid. I do. I think I don't see any purpose for it. I think it comes from a misreading of the Doctrine and Covenants that he leans into. He says, it says in the Doctrine and Covenants, thus shall my church be called, not thus shall my church be named, meaning we're going to call it the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not just that that's the name of the church. Well, you are, you're not in the United Kingdom. You're not in Northern Ireland, are you? You're in
I'm
Southern
currently
Ireland.
in England.
Oh, you're in England. Okay. When you ask somebody what their name is, how often will they say, well, I'm called Stephen? I mean,
Uh,
that's,
no.
no, they wouldn't say that.
Usually just say my name is
My
this.
name is sure. But like,
But yeah, you
when,
might sometimes say yeah. Well, would you? I don't think so. Oh no.
okay. Well, I'm trusting John Cleese and the movie A Fish Called Wanda.
Oh,
Uh, but in my experience, I had people say, "Well, I'm called so it's such and such." You go back into 19th century American colloquial speech, and called and named are essentially synonyms.
yeah.
Uh, that's saying, "Thus shall my church be named," or "Thus shall my church be called." There's no difference. There isn't inherent in that word, in the way Joseph Smith recorded it, the idea that this is a name that needs to be spoken out loud. It's just, this is the name of the church.
Right.
But President Nelson absolutely believed that's what that meant. It was very important to him. Insisted that this was, with all of the pressing needs of the world, this was the top of the list. The prophet, seer, and revelator has to make it so that we rewrite 200 years of colloquial speech, and we throw every other prophet before President Nelson under the bus, all of whom spent millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars promoting the word Mormon. I am a Mormon, meet the Mormons. All of that goes down the drain.
And
And
now it's everyone's wondering if could Mormon possibly be used a bit more again, or could it be coming back? There's been some of the legal instance with wanting the trademark
yeah,
Mormon and letters being sent out. My sort of view on it is like whenever I served my mission, I kind of was for sort of using, because sometimes I had a companion who would say like, "Oh, we're missionaries from the Mormon Church," and I sometimes thought like, I think we should emphasize the church's proper
yeah,
name. And so whenever he said like, we should use the full name of the church, part of me was like, yeah, I think it's good to emphasize that the full name of the church. But on the other hand, like my channel's called Mormonism with the Murph. I don't think
Yeah.
there's anything wrong culturally talking about ourselves as Mormons, or if people bring it up to us, I don't feel the need to correct us. You might say that the church's official name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
I know he felt very strongly about that, and I know there was even a talk, I think going back to the 1980s, where he had a talk about it then, or maybe it was from
Yeah.
the 90s. So it seemed like it was
From,
something that
it's
always
from
mattered.
October of 1990.
Okay, that's when it went. That's when it
Gave a
was. But
talk that's almost verbatim the same talk that he gave in 2018 when he became president of the church. And 6 months later, Gordon B. Hinckley gave a talk directly repudiating him.
yeah,
I mean,
I've
I've
seen the
never,
video with the clips from President Nelson's talk and
yeah,
President Hinckley, and it was quite funny. But a lot of members, like even they comment on my channel, being like, "We don't Mormonism isn't a thing. We don't use the word Mormon anymore." And I feel like that's almost a bit too far.
well,
I don't.
well, my point, I mean, the reason I raised that is not just to say I disagree with President Nelson, it's to say uh, I sustain President Nelson.
Mhm.
And so I did do everything sort of go out of my way to try to use Latter day Saint instead of Mormon, to try to avoid using the term Mormon,
Sure.
uh, even though I still think it's kind of silly. That was my way of sustaining President Nelson. Now that he's gone, I now go, okay, well, am I under more obligation to sustain President Nelson than I am to sustain President Hinckley, who repudiated President Nelson's argument? Now that they're both dead, can I choose which dead prophet I want to? I mean, I think it will. I don't know. I doubt, for instance, that the Tabernacle Choir will ever be the Mormon Tabernacle Choir again, which makes me kind of sad because I think that means something to people that the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square does not.
Yeah.
But but I do think that um, unless somebody else who becomes president of the church feels as strongly as President Nelson did, that it is not likely to endure. I don't see President Oaks caring about it that much. He hasn't made any reference to it since he became president of the church. There were some talks by apostles. Elder Anderson gave a talk about it, but a lot of those talks, I was kind of like, you're just kind of sucking up to the big guy. I don't see anybody else in the 12 that sort of wears that as their personal crusade. I mean, it's very clear that President Nelson sat on that for 30 years, that for, close to 30 years. I mean, he was waiting, chomping at the bit to finally get that out there because this was really, really important to him. And unless it's really, really important to somebody else, I the word Mormon never went away. It certainly never went away from anybody outside the church uh, because we didn't have anything to replace it with. I mean, if they're like, "Oh, you don't want us to call you a Mormon? Well, what would you like me to call you? I'd like you to call me a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." Well, that's 15 syllables. Mormon is 2 syllables. I
It's
have
too
word
long to
count.
fit on a thumbnail.
Yeah. I'm going to call you a Mormon unless you got something better. I mean, Latter Day Saint is close. He didn't even
Yeah.
like LDS, which is kind of silly. But Latter Day Saint is one, two, three. It's 3 syllables. No, it's 4 syllables. So, but you know, unless there's somebody enforcing it, I just think that the word Mormon is going to quietly make its way back into the vernacular, and I think it'll probably take 5 to 10 years, but I think it's coming back.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. So I want to finish with just a few more questions coming from someone who is more critically minded on this, or from a skeptic who might say like, look, we don't expect the prophets to be perfect or infallible, but when they are acting in the role as prophet, when they're declaring doctrine, or if they're claiming to receive revelation from God, that's quite a big claim, to claim that you're a prophet of God and that he's speaking to you. You shouldn't be wrong about that. A true prophet teaches true doctrine. A false prophet teaches false doctrine. And they might say that when you look at in our history, Adam God doctrine, which, Adam, the nature of God is a very important doctrinal issue. And for a prophet to teach something which has been later disavowed by later prophets about the nature of God, or things about race or blood atonement, like how can we trust that they are really prophets if they're getting some big things wrong? And if you're claiming to be a prophet, that's a big claim. There's that quote from Jeremy where he says in a CS letter, yesterday's doctrines, today's false doctrines, yesterday's prophets are today's heretics. And I can sort of see his point to that. What's your response to someone who says, like, if they're claiming to be a prophet and to receive revelation from God, it shouldn't be wrong or shouldn't be later changed or contradicted? What would you say?
Well, I'd agree with it. I mean, I'd agree that, it shouldn't be. But saying it shouldn't be leaves open the possibility that it might be. And I think if you eliminate that possibility, that it might be, that it could possibly be, then again, you defeat the purpose, the basic purpose of mortality. I talk about Adam God. This is going to sound a little bit like a tangent, but it isn't. It's bear with me. I was a seminary teacher in Westwood, California, behind the Los Angeles Temple for 3 years while I was going to the University of Southern California, and I had been a Sunday school teacher prior to that of the same students that were in my seminary class.
You've got very similar callings to me because I was a Sunday school teacher in my previous ward to youth, and now I'm a seminary teacher.
Oh, very nice.
Funny that.
Do you love teaching seminary?
I do, yeah. It's brilliant.
It
Anyway, you keep going with your story because
I just adore it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was a seminary teacher, and I had parents of my students write me a collective letter and sign it, and have their students bring it to me and say, "This is important." And the letter said, "We want to make sure that you teach our children correct doctrine about the fall." Because one of the things I'd said in the Sunday school class is, I do not buy the idea of conflicting commandments. I do not buy the idea that God would give a commandment that could not be obeyed. Book of Mormon talks about, I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded, for I know the Lord hath given no commandment unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way for them to accomplish the thing which he commandeth them. And I went, the idea that they couldn't keep both commandments and chose to keep one of them and not the other one. I mean, how does that work? Does he come down and say, well, have you multiplied and replenished the earth yet? No, we're trying. We're doing everything we can. We're experimenting, and nothing seems to be working. So that really bothered me. And they said, okay, we don't want you to teach that. That's your own personal heresy, Jim Bennett. We don't want you inflicting that on our children. And so I didn't. I kind of backed down on that. But I ruminated on that for years, if not decades. And I have finally come to the conclusion that my mistake is thinking about the fall in terms of it being about someone other than me or someone other than every one of us. Because you go through the temple, and there's a reason we're all supposed to liken ourselves to Adam and Eve. That we're all supposed to close our eyes when Adam closes his eyes. That we stand up when Adam stands up. It's because we are all each Adam and Eve, and we all make the same choice Adam and Eve did. We all made the same choice Adam and Eve did. Adam and Eve made the choice to leave the presence of God and go into the lone and dreary world where they have to learn for themselves the good from the evil. Each of us made that same choice. It's not about conflicting commandments. It's God saying, I will not make that choice for you. I will not force you to make that choice. That choice is going to lead you to sin. It's going to lead you to death. It's going to lead you to suffering. It's going to lead you to all kinds of terrible things. And so if you want to make that choice, you are welcome to make that choice. But I will not force you to make that choice. And so now that I see it in those terms, I now look at the world and I look at prophets and I say, okay, yes, prophets should not make mistakes. Prophets also will make mistakes, because if they don't make mistakes, then they will have defeated the purpose for why they came here. We should expect and even embrace the reality that prophets are going to make mistakes, and that's why we sustain them. They need us to sustain them because they cannot succeed unless the church is behind them, unless the church lifts them up and the church supports them, because they have the same weaknesses and they are going through the same kinds of trials that all the rest of us are. So for me, it's a matter of perspective. If you go to a prophet and you're saying, okay, your job, prophet, is to be right all the time, and if you're not right all the time, you've let me down. I'm sort of the customer here, you know. You work for me, prophet, and if you're screwing up on the job, I'm going to reject you, and you're not worth anything to me. That isn't the model we're supposed to follow. We are supposed to sustain the prophet. It's okay, prophet. I want to help you succeed, and I know that you need us to pray for you. You need us to help do the work of the church for you. You need us to go out and serve missions and fill callings and go to the temple and do all of that. And you're going to direct all of that. That is a huge, huge responsibility, prophet. I'm sure you're going to mess up somewhere along the way. I'm still going to sustain you. I'm still going to stand by you. I'm going to still not use the word Mormon, even though I think you made a mistake with that, President Nelson, because that is part of the challenge of discipleship and the purpose of mortality, is how do you navigate a church that is led by imperfect people? It's the Savior talking about how a prophet has no honor in his own country because the people in his own country all know that this is a prophet that's weak. You know, when Jesus first announced he's the Messiah, it's like, isn't this Joseph's son? Isn't this Mary's kid? I mean, who does this guy think he is? We grew up with this kid. What, he said now he's saying he's the son of God? Give me a break. I mean, when you know these people up close and personal, it's much harder to see them as anything other than another human being. And we expect our prophets to be something more than a human being, and they're not. I was in a class when my wife was teaching a gospel doctrine class about the second official declaration that gave the priesthood to people of all races, and came up the idea that it was a mistake, and people were saying, how could it be a mistake? And a church leader in the room said, look, it couldn't be a mistake. The thing you have to understand is these men are floating around with a spiritual understanding that we can almost barely understand. They're functioning on such a higher level that we just can't understand them. And I'm thinking back to my meeting with the presiding bishopric trying to roll Harry Reid. And I said, I think there are 15 people, men and women, in this room who are just as spiritual and just as righteous as the 15 people who sit in the highest offices of this church. And I stand by that. I think I don't think that the men who serve as prophets and apostles are somehow mystically, magically better than we are, more righteous than we are, more insightful than we are. I think they are men who have been called to a responsibility that we have not been called to. But I believe all are alike unto God. And I think this idea of, okay, well, a prophet is just something so much beyond who we are. That is a huge, huge, huge disservice. One final story, and then I'll shut up. So I served my mission in Scotland, which is where the Mackays came from. Mackays came from Thurso, Scotland, which is the northernmost point of the British mainland. There's nothing up there. There was a nuclear power plant up there, and they've closed it down. But it's this tiny little town up just on the edge of nowhere, right at the edge of the North Sea. And when I was serving my mission, I was assigned to serve in Thurso. And my mission president even said, okay, we're sending you up to Thurso. We haven't had any activity up there for years. And we're sending you up there for 6 months. And if nothing happens, we're going to shut down the area. I mean, and that was not something the mission president usually did. You're never told how long you're going to be serving somewhere. But he said, this is Thurso's last chance. Elder Bennett, you're Thurso's last chance. And I went, okay, this is it. I'm being sent to Thurso, and this is where the Mackays came from. This is really inspired. And of course, nothing was happening up there. We did end up baptizing a family in Wick, which is 30 miles away, that sort of saved the area and kept it from being closed. But that's not the point of this story. We were like, okay, we're up here. What do we do? How do we get any kind of activity up here? And we came up with the idea of, okay, I'm a descendant of David O. Mackay. David O. Mackay's family came from Thurso. What if we held like a public lecture called The Prophet from Thurso and just sort of tell the story of David O. Mackay and do it sort of as an academic sort of thing? And maybe that would attract some attention. And we proposed that to our mission president, and he said, oh, that's not a bad idea. And he called my parents and said, do you have any material that you can send Elder Bennett to help him with this lecture, which never happened. And I don't remember why we never even went through with it. But they did send me the material. And part of it included David O. Mackay's personal missionary journal. Now, I mentioned before that I grew up with sort of the weight of David O. Mackay as my great-grandfather on my shoulders. And Heber J. Grant is my great-grandfather. I have these two prophets. I used to tell my friends I'm descended from two Mormon popes. Popes don't have descendants, but Mormon popes do, apparently. and it was discouraging. It was not inspiring. It was discouraging. You know, there's this story. I would listen in Sunday school to stories of David O. Mackay. Like there's this story of him being very scared as a young child because he heard noises outside his window in his Huntsville house. And it was the tree scraping against the window. And so he knelt down and a voice spoke to him and said, nothing will hurt you. And I have slept in that room. Our family still owns that house. It's a dilapidated wreck in Huntsville, Utah, but we still own it. And I slept in that room as a kid, roughly the same age that David O. Mackay was when he had that experience. And I tried to replicate it. I wasn't scared of anything, but I knelt down and I'm like, look, you gave my great-grandfather, you spoke to him in this room. How about speaking to me? Nothing. And I just spent my entire life with this tremendous sense of inadequacy that I couldn't measure up. And I get this missionary journal and I'm reading it. And David O. Mackay, I don't say this to be disparaging, but he was a truly lousy missionary. Genuinely, he would take days off and go tour whiskey factories. He said borderline racist things about how ugly the Scottish people were. He missed his girlfriend. I had a girlfriend that I missed. And he was like, I'm a gloomy boy. I'm miserable. I'd sooner die than I'd as lief die as distribute tracts, is one of the lines from his journal. And I read this, and you go through it, and at no point does he have any success. He doesn't baptize anybody on his mission, not a single person.
Wow.
Part of it is that he was called into mission leadership fairly early into the mission, and so most of his job was administrative, kind of working in the mission office, I guess would be how we would describe it now. But there are no, he told the story in conference of seeing the whate'er thou art, act well thy part thing. Have you heard that story? He
I
was
think so.
discouraged, gloomy, and then he sees this plaque, and that turned everything around. Well, that story isn't even in his journal. And he was gloomy and miserable throughout his entire mission at different points. So I'm reading this journal, and it's like someone lifts this huge weight off the back of my shoulders. It was like, oh, David O. Mackay started out a whole lot like me. I mean, he was a lot like Jim Bennett, and then he went on to be David O. Mackay. And if he was able to start there and become that, there is hope for Jim Bennett. And to me, that idea, that story is so much more inspiring than the garbage we tell each other about how these men came down from Mount Olympus and were perfectly, you know, Greek gods from the day they were born, which is essentially the story we tell because we have this sort of de facto infallibility narrative. And to me, that was like, it's such a better story, and it's such a more faith promoting story. The idea that the church can have accomplished everything it has accomplished and can have blessed so many lives, even despite all of the weaknesses of its leaders and of its prophets. Isn't that a more inspiring story than the fact that the Lord handpicked 14, 15 men, perfect men, and plop them there, and all we have to do is listen to them spout their perfection, and then we don't have to do any thinking for ourselves or any struggle or any. I mean, that's a miserable story, and that really is Satan's plan. This is such a much better thing. So the very very long answer to your question is, I think it requires you to reevaluate your expectations of what a prophet is and what your responsibilities are to a prophet and to the church. John F. Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Ask not what the prophet can do for you, ask what you can do for the prophet. Ask what you can do for the church. How you can sustain, how you can lift, rather than worrying about, oh, geez, well, the prophet may make mistakes. What do I do if the prophet makes mistakes? You go to the Lord. You have as much access to the Lord as the prophet does. You go to the Lord and you figure it out. That's what you're here for.
So putting
So,
on my critical hat for a moment, because I can remember having a discussion with my dad whenever I was away from the church and had issues with prophets. And I remember asking him, if say President Nelson or President Oakes got up and started teaching Adam God or blood atonement, or started spouting off some of the things about race, that black people have the curse of Cain, or there's people that live on the moon, or say the earth is flat. Say they start spouting some of those things, saying like, would you still believe they're prophets? And I think part of him was sort of like, yeah, I'd sort of struggle if they were saying all those things now. It's sort of like, well, these men don't have really any credibility. And I sort of argued that, well, past leaders have taught some of those things, and they were prophets at the time. And I might argue that if you were to look at a religious leader in another religion or faith, or say I claim to be a prophet, say the Lord came and spoke to me, and the church has gone into apostasy, I should be the next prophet, and then I start giving revelations, but then say I start saying things like Eve is heavenly mother, or only Irish people can have the priesthood, everyone else is inferior, or I teach blood atonement, and then you might look at, or I teach like the earth is flat, and you might look at that and think, I'm not going to believe this guy, like, because he's getting so many things wrong. But then followers who would believe me could make the same argument that, well, he's fallible. Why you have so much expectations he would be right? And people might say that it's special pleading, and we're coming from the presupposition and assumption they are prophets. But an outsider might look at it as like, well, if they're getting things wrong about God, or if they've taught all this racist stuff, why should we even believe that they're prophets if they've gotten so many things wrong? And you wouldn't buy or accept it if this was another religious leader from another religion who was getting things wrong. And it's almost like there's no way that you could falsify any other person claiming to be a prophet. So like at what point do you say they're not a prophet? How do you go from a fallible to a false prophet?
No, that's an excellent point. Um, and it's not a hypothetical, at least in my mind. I mean, I wasn't around when they taught Adam God. I wasn't around when they taught blood atonement. I was around when they taught race in the priesthood, but just barely. I was 10 years old when the revelation came, and I wasn't aware that that was the policy. I had no idea that we had been doing all that. But the first time in my life where I was really confronted with, okay, the prophet is doing something that is absolutely wrong, was that policy of exclusion. I went, this is wrong. This is wrong. This did not come from God. The prophet is doing something that is wrong. And I start saying that publicly. And the first reaction from so many people is, well, then leave, get out of the church, which astonished me. I thought, really? That's the best you've got for me? I'm coming at you and saying, I really think this is wrong. And I want to stay in the church. I mean, that's the thing. People don't realize people who go through faith crisis, they want to stay in the church. They're looking for ways to do it and preserve their integrity. They feel like, oh gosh, I can't stay in the church because the church is so wrong. So, uh, and it made it very clear to me that people's responses to that come from a place of fear, come from a place of terror. It's that we don't have a good answer to that question. We don't have an institutional answer to that question because we've never wrestled with institutional fallibility in the way that I think we need to, and that I think eventually we will, because we really have no choice but to do it. So my special pleading answer is the one that I gave earlier about I took it to the Lord and I said, I can't stay in this church. And I received an answer that please stay in the church, be patient, it will all work out in the end. And I don't know that it's entirely worked out. I mean, the policy was lifted, but the problems that led to the policy and when the policy was lifted, I thought, aha, we're now going to have this conversation. This is so clearly a mistake that now we have to wrestle with whether or not prophets are fallible. And I think the very day it was lifted, Robert Reynolds and I were meeting with Tad Callister, who had just been released from the General Sunday School presidency.
Yeah.
Tad Callister. He's since just
Mhm.
passed away. But we were trying to get him in our documentary, and it became very clear within minutes that that wasn't going to happen. But we had a long conversation with him, and the policy had just been lifted, and he said, well, this is no big deal. Jesus at one point said, don't take purse or scrip. And then 3 years later, he said, now take purse or scrip. That's the way it works. And that was 3 years. And this policy was 3 years.
Right.
I mean, just making this direct equation. And I was like, really? That's your answer? There was a reason he said, don't take purse or scrip, and then said, okay, now I'm going to die. So you're going to need to take purse or scrip because I'm not going to be here with you to provide for you. I mean, there was a reason for it. What was the reason for saying, okay, we're going to punish children for who their parents are? Now we're not going to. What changed? Nothing changed other than the fact that the church was outraged by it. I mean, there was no circumstance that required it to be enacted in the first place. And so we didn't have that conversation as a church. We just sort of sidestepped that conversation. We are punting that conversation.
It's interesting because I've heard your experience of the 2015 policy. I'll share you briefly mine. I didn't learn about it. I was on my mission when it happened, and we visited with an inactive member of the church, and she shared part of the reason she stepped away was that policy. And I obviously, as very orthodox missionary, just said, look, I believe the prophets are called of God, and that This policy decision sort of came from the Lord and reaffirmed it. And I actually remember going to listen to a BYU devotional. I think it was given in Hawaii by President Nelson. And he talked about that policy in that statement. And he said it
Code of
wasn't just,
Revelation.
yeah, he said it wasn't just a declaration of policy, but it was the mind of the Lord and the will of the Lord upon his prophets. And yeah, basically saying it was revelation. And then I was out of the church. I was inactive whenever the policy reversed, and I actually at the time thought like, oh great, like God just changed his mind. Like that sort of further solidified me not believing in the church, and the prophets just changing things as they wish. But my sort of issue or concern with it is I agree with you. It's hard for me to believe that it was a revelation in 2015 and a revelation then in 2019 to change it. And if it was just a policy, I could understand. Like they made this policy, they counseled together, and it seems that this was a mistake. In hindsight, this was the wrong decision. The difficult thing is whenever President Nelson claims it was a revelation, and either he is lying or he is mistaken when he says that. And then the implication, if he is mistaken, is if they can't always discern or know when it's the Lord speaking to them and revealing, giving them revelation, or if it's just them, how are we supposed to trust them if they can't discern, distinguish? How reliable are they? And are we to believe that then everything else they teach is true and inspired, but they just got this thing wrong? And the backlash and the implications, the hurt and the harm from something like that. For some people, they might see it like if they got something as big as that wrong, how can we trust them? Because
Well,
they can't even discern revelation themselves, if that wasn't revelation from God.
um, correct. I mean, that is the discussion that we have yet to have on a church-wide level. It's a
Because that's
discussion.
something that I've wrestled with since then, and
Yeah,
it's a tough issue.
it
It's not an easy
absolutely
one.
is. I mean, the only answer I have to it is again a bit of special pleading. The reason why I didn't leave is because the Lord asked me to stay. And so I stay and I lean on that revelation, personal revelation, whenever I feel like, oh, geesh, I've had enough of this. I'm very frustrated with this and I'm furious about this and I'm blah, 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 blah. I come back to, I personally know that this is where the Lord wants me. And that really is the basis of my testimony at this point.
Mhm.
My testimony is probably not really something that a lot of apologists would be happy to hear because I'm not going out there saying, I have this rock solid assurance that the Book of Mormon is an ancient record, or any of the. It's not based on. What it's based on is my personal encounter with the divine, and my personal encounter with God, and my personal understanding that this is where God wants me, and I'm going to follow that and see where that leads. But that's something that I trust and I have confidence in, enough confidence in to allow it to guide my life. So. I mean, I think the broader answer to that question, Joseph Smith talked about how I wish all of you were prophets. I wish would that, I think that there's an Old Testament prophet that would that the entire nation of Israel were prophets. The idea, the model I think works is not the model of, okay, the prophet speaks, the thinking has been done, and you can always count on the prophet not to make a mistake, so you don't have to do anything. The model is the prophet is a coach, is a guide. The prophet is pointing you to Christ. And so often we mistake the prophet for Christ. I think a lot of the things that we do, I really get frustrated In the tabernacle choir, when the prophet enters the conference center and we all stand up and we're silent until the prophet goes and sits down, I go, this is an act of worship. This is not just a sign of respect. We are acting like we worship this man. And I don't worship these men. I respect them. I sustain them. I don't worship them. And we mistake the prophet for Christ. And if we look at the prophet and say, okay, he is a guide, he is a coach, he is pointing us to Christ, he's making the introduction, but we have to close the deal. We have to make that connection. It's not just enough to say, oh, well, I've heard the prophet. It's, oh, okay, how do I get closer to God? How do I get closer to Christ? And the prophet can help direct me in that direction. But if I think that the prophet is Christ, if I think it stops there and the infallibility that we require from a perfect God is embodied in this imperfect man, we're going to stumble. And I think we as a church are stumbling because I think that to a large degree is what we do as a church. We get confused and we think when we say, whether by my own voice or the voice of my servants, it is the same. So Russell Nelson, Dallin Oaks, they are the same as Jesus. They are Jesus, essentially.
They perpetuate a lot of those statements. I still hear it at church. I still hear it in the culture. You still hear it in conference talks. Although we don't claim that they're infallible, the things that we say is very much follow the prophet. He will always teach the truth. He won't lead you astray, whether by my own voice or the voice of my servants. And I don't think we fully, really addressed prophetic fallibility. I think President Uchtdorf came close, and he did sort of say that there's been times where mistakes have been made, things said or done out of harmony with our teachings or principles or doctrine. But I think the fear is that if they were maybe to be fully open about their fallibility or that they're not doctrinally inerrant, it might cause church members to lose some trust in them as, oh, how can we know that what they're saying is right or reliable? And the other point I wanted to say in response to, because I really like the point you're making about them being like our coach and they point us to Christ. And that's very much how I see it, that some of the messages that I've received from General Conference in the last few years, there have been some which have been very much like, this has felt really inspired, really edifying, really uplifting. Some of the prophets' addresses and messages, I loved his one on peacemaking. There was one he gave that
I consider the peacemaking talk to be not only President Nelson's best talk, but arguably the best talk I have ever heard in a general
yeah,
conference.
yeah, it was just, it seemed inspired, profound, it seemed much needed. There's been other talks which have felt like personally inspired for me. And I love what you're saying about that, and that we need to seek our own revelation that they're giving us. They're almost like teaching correct principles, but we need to govern ourselves and seek our own revelation. But also, we do sometimes hear in conference talks when it comes to seeking personal revelation, well, how do you know that revelation is right and is from God? Well, it must align with what the prophets are saying. Because if it contradicts what the prophets are saying or what the scriptures say, then that's a good indicator that this isn't coming from the Lord, because the Lord wouldn't contradict himself. But then what do you do in that scenario where you feel that you have a disagreement, or if you feel like you have revelation that conflicts against what the prophets are teaching? Because if you were to say at church, I disagree with the prophet on this, or I've received personal revelation that goes against the church's official doctrine or policy, they would, members would say that, well, your revelation, if it's really from the Lord, will align with the prophet.
Well, you're seeing, I mean, again, that's not a hypothetical. You're seeing a lot of that right now, particularly. We just interviewed Karen Hyatt, who was excommunicated for teaching that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist.
Mm.
We've had conversations, public conversations, and some private conversations with Michelle Brady Stone, who had a huge following teaching this and insists that what she's teaching is right and the church is wrong, and the church is not okay with it, and required her to pull all of her stuff down. And so I mean, this is a tension that is very real and has ever sort of been with us. Um, uh, you know, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in your comment here when you talked about that they're scared that people will lose trust. If they admit that they've made mistakes, that people will stop trusting them. And I think you're right. They are scared. I think they're scared of the wrong thing. Because if they were to admit, okay, yes, we've made mistakes, and not just we forgot your birthday mistakes, not just we have bad breath mistakes. We've made mistakes. The priesthood ban was a mistake. Plural marriage. Uh, I mean, that one's harder because that one's encoded in actual revelation.
Yeah,
But I think
canonized in Doctrine and
there are
Covenants.
many things about plural marriage that the church could admit were really colossal mistakes. But anyway, on and on and on. Um, uh, you, that would cause it would be like ripping a band-aid off. It would be extraordinarily painful in the moment. But by refusing to rip the band-aid off now, we are making our reckoning in the future that much more difficult because this cannot be sustained over time. And the reason young people leave the church to such a large degree is a lack of trust. It's not a faith crisis in the sense that it's much more of a trust crisis. When you learn about the rock and the hat, you don't leave over the rock and the hat so much as you leave over the church didn't tell me about the rock and the hat. Why didn't they tell me about the rock and the hat? Why don't they trust me enough to tell me the truth? So, in the short term, the church thinks it's accomplishing something by not acknowledging errors, but it's costing them the long term because you don't trust people who don't trust you and don't trust you enough to tell you the truth. In the long term, I mean, I think in the short term, yes, I think a lot of people would leave if the church were as upfront and open as they eventually will need to be. A lot of people initially will go, "Well, I can't do this." Long term, it builds genuine trust. A church that trusts me enough to admit, "Hey, we got this wrong. Please bear with us. Please sustain us because we need it, because we're just like you and we get things wrong and we need your help." That's a church that needs me. That's a church that values me. That's a church that trusts me and a church that I can trust in return. And I genuinely am optimistic that we will get there. I think it will be a rocky road because I think we're just starting to get there. I mean, a lot of the things that the church has done to improve transparency are very significant and very quiet. I think the Joseph Smith Papers is a revolutionary project.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's
It's
revolutionary,
super transparent. It's all the
super
documents are out
transparent.
there,
And what percentage of the church knows it's even happening? Uh,
or is reading
10%?
through it.
Uh, Reading through it, 1%? I mean, it is not something they're advertising. It's not something they're pushing. It's something they're doing quietly. And it's something that some members greatly appreciate, but most members don't even know it's there. Gospel topics essays, still to this day, if you quote them in a Sunday school class, there will be somebody in the Sunday school class who thinks you're reading from an anti-Mormon pamphlet. No, that's not from the church. I mean, there's a woman in my ward who insists they made a mistake with that essay. That was just written by BYU, and they somehow got it on the church's website. Like, really, really, you think the church would let it stay on the church's website
Yeah,
for
not a
close to
chance.
10 years? I mean, give me a break. So we are at the beginning. I mean, this is a question that I don't have a glib, easy answer to. I found my own personal answer to it, and I think that everybody who is wrestling with it is going to have to find their own personal answer to it. And a lot of people have found the answer to it is, well, I have to leave the church. And I can respect that entirely. I mean, this is the other thing is that since I've been sort of involved in this apologetic world, I completely ignored everybody on, and I think most members of the church completely ignore everybody on the edge of the church, whether they're on the edge of the inside or the edge of the outside. There's a huge swath of people there, and there's a huge amount of pain and frustration and struggling there, and we ignore it. We completely ignore it. We just, if you've left the church, you're a Korahor, you're an apostate, and we can't even talk to you anymore. And a lot of people who've gone all the way out, it's like, well, everybody in the church is a total, I mean, they're all deluded and brainwashed. They're in a cult and they're all terrible. But there are all of these people on the edge that are, they're either holding on by the skin of their teeth on the inside, or they've got spouses and children who are still in, but they're out. They don't believe. They kind of want to believe, but don't know if they can. I mean, we don't talk to those guys. And I think in many ways, those guys are kind of the answer to this question. Because if we can find a way to answer this question that's satisfying, and I think the answer, I think the answer is you embrace fallibility. You change the model. You say, okay, not only have we made mistakes, we're going to make mistakes. I don't know what they're going to be, but we're going to make them. And unless you're here to help us, to help build Zion, and we're going to listen to you, we're going to pay attention to you. We're not going to pretend that revelation we get is divorced from our interaction with you. Revelation is going to come from the top down. Revelation is going to come from the bottom up, and we're all going to work together, and we're all going to build Zion. I mean, that's an exciting church to belong to. I think that's the church that will be here by the time the Savior finally comes again. But we've got a long way to go before we get there.
I love that. One final question for someone who feels like they're, as you described, sort of like on the outside or sort of in the inside, but holding by a thread. Someone who is struggling with doubt, struggling with church history, struggling with prophets and prophetic fallibility. Somebody who maybe wants to believe, but they don't know how. What would you say for someone to, how can they still believe in, the authority of prophets and apostles and them being the Lord's servants while being fallible, but still trusting that they're reliable, though they might make mistakes? And what advice would you give to someone who is struggling to intellectually reconcile it, but still wants to believe?
An excellent question. I think the only person or the only way, the only one who can convince them to believe is the Lord. I mean, once you reach that place, and I think I've reached that place multiple times actually in my life, most recently with the 2015 policy. But when I went through my big faith crisis at 18 after reading the God Makers, I think I was in that place. But at 18, I was able to, okay, well, my father and my uncle and other sort of people I respect, I trust them. And so I'll stay in the church for them. I don't remember ever having kind of a direct encounter with the Lord in a way that I did in 2015. By 2015, there wasn't anybody. It's not that there wasn't anybody that I could trust, but there wasn't anybody that could convince me, well, just trust me, this policy is okay. This policy is of the Lord. You should stay in the church because you should just trust me. And that included Russell Nelson. Or Thomas Monson. President Monson was still president of the church, although I think he was in the throes of dementia at the time, which is another issue altogether. But you reach a point at some point, I think, where the only person you can trust is the Lord. And when I have said that to some people, they've said, yeah, I've reached that point, and I turned to the Lord, and I got nothing. I've been pleading. I'm trying to think of anybody that has had a similar experience to mine where it's like, oh, well, I turned to the Lord and the Lord told me to stay in the church. I don't know that I can point to a person who said that. Far more often when I have this conversation with people, they say, yeah, I've turned to the Lord. Lord hadn't said anything to me. And I, I have to honor that. I have to respect that. I mean, the people who are like, well, you just haven't prayed hard enough. I don't buy that at all. I mean, people in faith crisis, and having been in faith crisis, you know this more than
Yeah.
anybody, you're praying harder than you've ever prayed in your entire life.
Yeah. So your most intense, urgent prayers.
They're the most intense prayers. And if you're doing that and you're not getting any kind of answer, I mean, I also don't know anybody that said, well, I prayed and prayed, prayed, and the Lord told me the church was false. I haven't ever heard anybody like that. But they just assume, well, God doesn't exist. That's why I haven't gotten an answer. I've heard that. But that's all I've got. I mean, that's the only answer I've got is that keep praying. And at some point, if you're not getting that answer and you stop praying, I will not stop respecting you and loving you for your faith journey and doing whatever I can to support and sustain you. I mean that because that's all I've got. I can't force you to believe, and I don't think anybody else can either. And if the Lord isn't answering that prayer, then the Lord will have to answer for why He's not answering that prayer. But that's not my responsibility. All I can do is offer my own personal, small, individualized experience here. And I don't expect anybody to stay in the church because Jim Bennett has had any kind of an experience with God. I mean, if people trust me, I'm honored. That's lovely. If my experience is in any way helpful to anybody, I am honored beyond words. But my experience isn't going to keep anybody in the church. My experience isn't going to be a substitute for someone else's individualized experience. I mean, did you have some kind of, I mean, when you came back to the church, was there a moment where you felt like, I mean, you talked about that earlier, that was sort of one of the most spiritual moments of your life. Was there a single moment where the Lord said to you, essentially, come back to church?
Yep. Yeah. I felt like I had very profound personal revelations and felt like the Lord spoke to me mostly through scripture, confirming at least the truth of the words, the revelations that Joseph was a prophet. But actually, the thing that I felt really pulled me back to the church was listening to a talk by Elder Uchtdorf. It was around the same time. I think it was called "Come Join with Us."
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember all the specifics of it, but I think it was actually that talk, the one where he addresses fallibility and
Mm-hmm.
prophets making mistakes. But he talked about those people who feel like they don't belong, who have doubts, who struggle with faith, and very much that there is a place for you, and the Lord wants you in this church. And that was one of those times where I felt this pull to come back to the church. And while I still had a lot of my intellectual doubts and issues, I felt like I couldn't deny at that time the spiritual experiences that I'd received and the revelation, and I felt like everything was pointing to calling me to come back to the church, and why I think there's a lot of nuance when it comes to being the only true and living church, and what it means to be prophets and apostles. I do believe that this is Christ's restored church, and I believe in their prophetic authority. But it's been then trying to make sense of, like, okay, how do I make sense of all of these issues and past false doctrine taught, and how do prophets receive revelation and how reliable they are? But if it wasn't for that experience, I don't think I would have came back. And one other experience I'll share, since this just came to my mind, right before I got married to my wife, I was back in sort of a bit of a deep faith crisis again. I don't know if it's just been one long drawn out faith crisis, but this was back in spring 2021, a few months prior to us getting married, and we were going to get married in Mexico because she had just gone back to Mexico because her visa had ended. She's from Mexico originally. And this was during COVID, so it was a very stressful, uncertain time with lots of things going wrong. And I was similar to you, not sure about if marrying her was the right decision. Didn't feel like I received any strong revelation. And I was unsure if I was really still believing in the church. And this was a huge decision, getting married, but also like, am I going to stay in the church and do I really believe? And I remember just going in prayer. This was prior to general conference, just with all of my concerns and my issues. I still have a lot of doubts with truth claims, with prophets. Should I, go get married? Is this the right decision? And just felt like I needed something. And I remember listening to general conference, and no talk that I listened to was really resonating. It was just like, just the same old talks we hear like every time. But then President Nelson in the Sunday session, I was praying about like President Nelson being a prophet as well. Um, President Nelson gave a talk, Faith to Move Mountains. And unfortunately, the only thing that critics tend to remember from that talk is the reference he made about lazy learners, lax disciples, which I didn't care too much for that reference. But his talk in a nutshell was about that we're going to face mountain-sized obstacles or challenges in our lives. And it could be doubt, it could be certain trials, whatever it is. But if you have faith the size of a seed, you can move mountains. God can move mountains if you have faith the size of a seed. And so much of his conference talk in that message seems so applicable to me and my circumstance, because the two big mountains I had was one, all my doubts, but also all the obstacles before getting married. And I had this very distinct impression. And it's interesting because I'm someone who constantly questions, is this the spirit or is it just me? Are these my thoughts or not? But sometimes you can have moments where the impression is very distinct. And I had a very distinct impression, almost a voice telling me that this is the right decision and you'll be able to get married. And if there's going to be a lot of obstacles, but if you have faith, God will sort of provide the way. And there is so many obstacles before getting married, with flights cancelling and visa issues and documents we need to get married. And getting married in a foreign country during COVID was not a good idea.
Sure.
Yet I felt very strongly the impression was this was the right decision in the right time and to go forward, and everything worked out. And even though I didn't feel like that gave me a super strong testimony that I know that President Nelson is a prophet of God, that he's directly communing with Jesus, I had the faith that I believed that he was the Lord's servant, that he was inspired, given that message, and that was the Lord almost speaking to me, giving a message for me. And I felt like I was able to have the faith that I could say that I sustain him as prophet and president of the church. I still have questions when it comes to fallibility and prophets getting things wrong, but that was a time where I felt like I was able to exercise faith and felt like I saw a miracle from acting upon that faith. And I could have very much chosen to just, act upon my doubts and that I can't reconcile things, but I viewed the experiences that happened as almost many blessings and miracles of acting in faith. So those are two times where I felt that pull to come back to the church, and that was a time where I felt like the Lord gave an inspired message to President Nelson that I needed to hear, that helped me at that time in my life.
Well, so maybe I need to change my answer when I say I never met somebody else who's had that kind of a direct encounter with the Lord, because you clearly have. But I think that's the only answer at the moment that works to that very difficult question. But I think it's a question that we need to continue to ask. That come join with me talk. One of the things Ian, my podcast partner, talks about is, okay, yeah, President Uchtdorf said, um, there have been times we made mistakes. But what happens when you say, okay, well, what mistakes?
Yeah,
Can
we
you
never
point?
really talk about what are the
Can you
mistakes
point me
they've
to a
made. We
mistake?
say, yeah, we believe prophets are fallible, but we don't get into what are those things.
Yeah, and I mean, so really, we are just at the beginning of this conversation as a church. This is a conversation that we can no longer avoid. It's one of the reasons I say this over and over and over again. But we have no choice but to confront all the difficult issues of the church head on. No choice but to talk about all the messiness of polygamy. Look straight at, okay, Was Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger an affair, as a lot of the evidence seems to suggest? What's the deal with Joseph marrying 14-year-old girls? Because if we don't confront that head on in a way where everyone is part of the conversation, then we get Michelle Brady Stones and we get Karen Hyatt's, who are filling the vacuum, filling the void with answers that people want to hear. They want to hear Joseph wasn't a polygamist because that's a whole lot easier to believe, at least for some people. For me, it's even harder to believe because then it makes Brigham a complete monster.
Yeah.
But
and it's one huge conspiracy as well.
Yeah,
we won't get into that, but yeah.
Well, I want to get into that. But the point is there is a hunger for that, and there is a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled with easy answers or with false answers, or with, the reality is so much harder to confront, but really, in my mind, so much more rewarding once you do it. Once you accept David O. Mackay was a lousy missionary, okay, there's a shock to that initially, but it's also, oh, well, maybe there's hope for me yet. I mean, I don't think that for all there being prophets, seers, and revelators, that they're looking beyond the moment they're terrified of, which is the moment where there's this huge outcry once they admit that the church has made big mistakes. There will be a moment. There will be people who leave. There will be, that will be difficult when that finally happens. They're trying to maybe parcel it out so it's not one big moment, but that it's a whole lot of little moments. But I think that does
little
more damage.
Increments.
Incrementally, but I don't think they've looked past that moment, because what's past that moment is Zion. What's past that moment is a church of equals where we all work together and sustain each other and realize that, yeah, we make mistakes. That's what this is all about. That's why we're here. And we're here to learn from each other. We're here to buck up each other after we make those mistakes. We're here to atone for those mistakes or repent for those mistakes. The church talks about individual repentance, but refuses to engage in institutional repentance ever. We have a president of the church who insists that the church does not give apologies. Well, what if I just said, you know what, I'm going to repent, but I'm never going to apologize to the people I've wronged, ever. It's my policy not to seek apologies or to give them on a personal level. The church wouldn't tolerate that, but that's the church's policy institutionally. And my confidence comes from the reality that can't be sustained. That can't be sustained over time. Eventually, things that can't go on forever eventually stop. And this can't go on forever.
Absolutely. Well, Jim Bennett, this has been a great discussion. I think this is an important one. Like you said, I think we need to have more of these discussions and wrestle over prophetic fallibility and what that means. And I appreciate the work that you do, your podcast Inside Out, and you need to get that book published as well. I want to read it. What's it called? Fallibility, a love
Fallibility,
song?
a love story.
Yeah. A love story. Okay. No, a love song. It could be a love song, though. Love it.
So yeah, I will send you a copy, and
yeah, I'd like to read it.
So we'll see what happens.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. This has been fun. And
thank you, sir.
Yeah, and listeners who are watching, give this video a like, comment, share, subscribe. Go check out Jim and Ian's podcast as well, and we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.